Dr. Picard, would you like to, particularly if you believe, I mean, one of the things about journalism and news is that, and you mentioned, I think, in your presentation, that people have never just bought the newspaper for news, but in journalism, this whole idea of it being the foundation of democracy and a public service and not just, infotainment.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly is a huge problem, because if we believe that in the future society needs a source of information that helps the democratic process, and if we believe that the newspaper has to be that role, we have to do something different than we're doing today. I'm a believer that, I mean, there's nothing sacred about newspapers. Newspapers took on this role a century and a half ago because there needed to be an intermediary between the government and in a large-scale society that was not possible in other means. The newspapers filled that role, and as have other media, quite well for many decades. Do they need to do that in the future? And that becomes a really interesting question. If the newspapers don't do it, someone else will. Some other function will solve it. We solve problems in a very different way. The problem with quality is that none of us know what it is. Okay? And that journalism education has been ongoing now for 80 years on a regular basis. Nobody has yet been able to define what journalism quality is. We define it by its absence. We know it when we don't see it, but we don't know it when we see it. And so there's this real problem when we deal with those questions of quality, I think.
Gary, do you want to take a stab at that?
Well, I mean, one thing we've sort of been focusing on this morning is the print edition and the online edition. But I've heard, Arthur Sulzberger of the New York Times talk about being platform agnostic. And over the course of time, obviously, there are going to be other platforms on which to deliver news and information. So maybe we have to think outside of just the print and website, paradigm and start thinking about other things. I mean, we all have handheld devices. We're going to be using those more for news and information. At this publishers conference I was at earlier this week, there was a gentleman from Europe that did a presentation about mobile technology and monetizing mobile technology. So I guess one of the ways is to look for new and different revenue streams beyond just the print product and the internet site. But again, this is very challenging because of the way the business model works and the capacity of the print edition to generate cash. And it's really very, very difficult to duplicate that in a platform that is not press and pulp and ink.
Well, sure. Our audience is dying to ask questions. Maybe. Comments, questions? Yes, back there.
Probably more for Vin, but all of you. I'm curious about, as you look at this, the conflict between the infinite size of the web for advertising and the very restricted size of the web page for advertising. And no one really mentioned that, but I'm wondering if that's also one of the keys to our low percentage of revenue in that.
It's off. Do I have to press the button here? Okay. All right. Well, I think anybody who's designed a website and tried to deal with that small, enclosed video monitor space knows how hard it is to solve that problem. But I don't think it's necessarily the space. I think it's more what Gary mentioned earlier, that the advertisers themselves are building sites and starting to disintermediate us on this stuff. That's become a bigger problem on the ad side.
I would just add that I think broadband technology is kind of doing away with that space issue in the sense that you could click on something and if you have a good broadband provider, like we do here in Austin most of the time, that page will come up, almost instantaneously. So there's really a lot of creative opportunity that you get online via broadband that you don't get in print. So I would suggest that that the technology opens up a bigger window, if you will, for advertising some creativity.
I directed a project for the European Commission for 2 years on talking to 250 top advertisers in Europe and what do they actually want to do with internet, mobile, and interactive technology. And it was one of the most revealing things that I've ever been through in talking to them. And essentially, they want to cut out anybody that they have to pay anything. Period. Okay? And the problem is, all of these new technologies provide essentially a good capacity to do that and for them to reduce their overall marketing expenditures by bringing it in-house to their own actual uses. And for anybody who looks at business models of media, whether it be magazines, newspapers, television, or online, those things are absolutely scary.
Let me actually answer one thing for Clyde's question more directly, and I'm thinking it's the other possibility, which fits in with Gary talking about new modes. We are starting to see the first experiments with electronic paper in Europe right now. It's not yet the saran wrap type of thing you roll up and put in your pocket, but it's the Tilde, the business paper in Belgium, and also this Echoes in Paris are now starting to equip readers with these things. The idea you beam it into them, and it's a larger space, but it's also interactive. Click on the quote, hear the quote, click on the picture, see the video. Click on the link, and it's hyperlinked. It's basically what you saw in the movie Minority Report, which, by the way, was designed by the MIT Media Lab for Spielberg. And so, we may be going to cases where you have the layout of print or something larger than a mobile tiny screen, but all the interactivity of the web, that will solve some of the problems.
I'm sorry, I just Well, I just wanted to make, about that question about funding, Card made a point earlier about innovation and the lack of investment in R&D at newspaper companies, and I think that's very important. I deal with the research departments at 130 major newspapers around the country, and I can tell you that 99% of those research departments spend all of their time and effort on creating information to sell advertising. They do not look at new products. They do not do research on innovation. I think that's something the industry really has to change and invest in R&D and innovation and not spend all their research resources on just selling advertising.
Yeah, I realize that y'all, and I agree with this, that the newspaper industry does need to be looking at that other 90% of that share of potential internet advertising. But is it still worthwhile, do you think, to go after the traditional classified verticals like in real estate? I mean, is it still worth our while since you have these companies that are building their own sites and doing fairly well at that?
Well, it depends on where you're located and what your paper is. If for instance, you are in a community where the Auto Dealers Association is not particularly active yet, the key is to engage them and become their supplier. The key is to become the real estate person's supplier along the way. But I mean, I get scared when I go to sites like Rent.com, which just scares the hell out of me. If you haven't been to it, go look at it. Rent.com, in fact, eBay bought it this year because they liked it so much. Rent.com, if you have a house or apartment to rent, you go to Rent.com, you don't pay them anything, and they pay your listing. If it rents, you pay them, I think its current price, about $400, which is very, very low cost for out of that $400, they take $100 and give it to the person who went to the site and rented through the site. Okay? Now, you want to talk about being scary for newspapers, and what those are the kind of things that newspapers have allowed to happen by not getting in there themselves, and by thinking about how you make money in this business in a very traditional way. And those are the things that newspapers have got to change along the way. If newspapers are not the primary provider for advertising and information in the communities, they are dead in the years to come, one way or another.
And there's some irony in this, and that I was at a conference, newspaper conference about, I think it was 98, where one of the speakers said, look, most of you folks are from Hearst, McClatchy, Knight Ridder, Dow Jones, Gannett, companies named after people who took risks and did new things. What have you guys done? And it's a good question.
But I think in the short term, you definitely have to stay in that classified space because classified is such a big part of your revenue. You can't abandon it. You need to partner with your local classified advertisers and try to keep that revenue coming as long as you can. Otherwise, you're going to take the trip to the butcher a lot quicker than you'd want to.
Okay. Well, thank you, panelists. We're going to break for a minute before we go on to our next panel discussion.
This seems cool.